Thank you, Adam, for inviting me, and thank you, everybody, for bothering to show up when it's going to be online later. That's pretty impressive in this day and age. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land on which we're meeting today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And they might be exactly the people that are going to help us in the future for biodiversity, as well as a lot of other things as well, I suspect. This talk is possibly going to be the antidote to happiness, as Brock suggested might be a good idea, so, but hopefully not. Hopefully it will be a talk about hope, and it'll be a talk a lot about the future, but also I think the problem with being a scientist is that it means you tend to study what you already know, what's already happened, and what have you. So forgive me if I have a very historical approach to the future, and also I'm a zoologist and an animal biologist, an animal ecologist and wildlife biologist, so it's going to have a very animal-y theme, which is not necessarily, well, it's a bias essentially, and we know that that's not great either, but that's enough excuses. On with the show. So biodiversity, I'm going to assume that you know nothing about biodiversity. It's going to make it easier for anybody that doesn't know. But biodiversity as a word has only actually been around since about the 80s, so not very long at all. Biological diversity was the term that was first coined, and biodiversity is just a combination of the two. So back in the day, we used to mix our Greek and our Latin up, but Greek for mode of life, so literally living things, and divertere or something, my Latin's not great, to go different ways, so the divergence, of course, you're familiar with that word. And so biodiversity is the study of living things that have gone their separate ways, individual entities. So defining biological diversity or biodiversity is actually not all that easy. The closest thing that we have got to our definition of biodiversity is from the 1992 UN Convention on Biological Diversity, which states it is the variability among living organisms from all sources, not restricted to, but including terrestrial, marine, and other aquatic ecosystems, and the ecological complexes of which they are part. That includes diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems. So our nice little squirrels here, if you've been in the Northern Hemisphere, you might recognise those. These two are both the same species, they're both grey species. This guy is the melanistic version, so he's just got a bit more black pigment than the grey version, but they're the same species to all intents and purposes. I hope you recognise this one, whether or not you've been to the Northern Hemisphere, and this is our beautiful fern tree rainforest that we find in the Dandenongs. So when we're talking about within species, we're talking about this as biodiversity here, and also this as biodiversity, and then the differences between all of them as biodiversity as well. Now that's a little bit problematic because the definition that states that it is animals and plants and everything, and the complexes and the habitat and the marine and the terrestrial and the rocks and the biota and the abiota and everything else, means that biodiversity is literally everything, which becomes problematic because then when you're talking about more diversity or less diversity, if it's everything, then you can't reduce it or make it more, right? That's what physics tells us. That's not even a biology question. So it's the plants, and it's the rocks, and it's the fungi, and like this is a slime mold, this is a protist, perhaps we don't really know. It's also the bacteria and literally everything, but also the water and the sky and the gases and the the soils and literally everything. And that's a bit problematic as well, because there is an argument that states that actually most of biodiversity in the whole world is bacterial or viruses or organisms that we can't even see. But we have this real bias as humans to only talk about and not acknowledge things that we can see, things that we can touch, things that we believe exist. And there's a whole world of germs on this table in front of you. So don't have nightmares, it's okay, they're not all bad. But the point is that there's biodiversity as it stands, is such a complex issue. We're not even really in any agreement as to what constitutes a species. And so we have lots of problems with biodiversity, but that's where the future comes in. And over time, we're going to get closer to what we mean by biodiversity and how that interacts with us. We can already measure biodiversity in some respects. So genetics is a measure of biodiversity. So when we're talking about the squirrels, the black squirrel and the grey squirrel, the same species, but they have differences in their genotypes, as do all of us in this room. And so that's diversity within a species. And genetic biodiversity is also completely legitimate as well. We can also measure species richness and abundance. So how many species we have in any given area and how many of each of those species as well. So those are measures of biodiversity. And there's also biodiversity indices. So Shannon's Index and others, if you've done ecology at university, you'll be well familiar with them, where it's essentially a way of giving a measurement to biodiversity. We also talk about alpha, beta and gamma biodiversity. So whether you are talking about the alpha diversity, so going back to the bacteria on this one table, that's very alpha. The beta biodiversity might be the bacteria on the whole floor, or perhaps in the whole building, and then the gamma biodiversity is looking at the whole city. And that's important because when we're talking about biodiversity, we need to know what scale we're talking at, because if you count the biodiversity, or you measure the biodiversity of a small area, it can be in conflict with the amount of biodiversity in bigger areas. We do know that if you have higher biodiversity through any of those measures, that it is good. And there's no two ways about it. It's good. It's good for us. It's good for the planet. It increases ecosystem productivity. So the more pollinators you've got, the more pollinating you have, and the more plants you have, which means that it also supports agriculture. Trees, plants, the natural world helps stabilize climate, really important. Protects freshwater resources, so we all drink water. You've probably seen instances of reed beds being used to clean and filter drinking water. Great stuff. That's biodiversity at work right there. Promotes soil formation and protection, so biodiversity nourishes soils. The more stuff, the more biodiversity we've got in a soil, the healthier it is, the better the crops grow, the better the rainforests grow, the better everything grows. Provides nutrient storage and recycling, so the more biodiversity you've got in the soil, all that shit is being eaten by dung beetles and by microbes and everything. The more biodiversity you've got, the quicker that shit's getting eaten and turned back into soil which we can use. Helps break down pollutants, much the same way. Provides more pharmaceutical resources. Now, that used to be back in the 80s, that was the one reason we were always given to save the rainforest, was what if the cure for cancer is in the rainforests, and we still don't know whether it is or not, but maybe it is. And actually, as time goes on, we are even stepping away from plants and using more and more animals as forms of biomedical science. So I work with amphibians, and there is lots of research going on about regenerating limbs, because salamanders and frogs and amphibians, they lose a leg, they just regrow it. Wouldn't that be great if we could do the same thing? Who knows? And of course, more opportunities for recreation and tourism. We all like to go on holiday to pretty places. Even if we want to stay in a nice hotel, we want it to be by a nice beach. We don't want the beach to be boring, ugly, destroyed, all the rest of it. Many, many more reasons to protect biodiversity that we don't perhaps even know about at this point. Some of them we do, and I just couldn't fit them on the page, but there's many reasons. And one of the big ones for me is that biodiversity has intrinsic value. So this ethical idea that because biodiversity is, we have a responsibility to protect it. And not everybody agrees with that. And sometimes, I'll pitch a talk that says, oh, we should save biodiversity because of the environmental goods and services, which is this part of the list, right? The things that the environment provides for us as human beings. And some ecologists will say that I've sold out, because ultimately a lot of people believe that this alone is sufficient a reason to protect biodiversity. The intrinsic value of biodiversity is enough on its own to protect it. So biodiversity hotspots is a term that you've probably heard before, whether you know what it means or not. Less likely. That's at least in part because there's multiple definitions, just like there is for species and for biodiversity itself. This is our own government's definition. So it's these countries here, it's measured in countries. It's really interesting to measure biodiversity by country, as if all the ants get to the border and go, well, they're not going any further. But anyway, you can see the obvious patches through the world. And according to the definition from our own government, 10% of the global surface has more than 70% of the biological diversity all over the world. So these darker blue-green colours contain 70% of the Earth's biodiversity, but it's only 10% of the land surface. Conservation International has another definition, and it's a bit more dynamic perhaps, by not including the political borders. And their definition says that it has to have a certain amount of endemics, so animals and plants. And again, sadly, it's mostly animals and plants that are measured, even though the fungi and the protists and the bacteria and everything probably make up far more of the biomass of that area. But the animals and plants must be, a certain percentage of them must be endemic, which means that they're found in that area and nowhere else in the whole world. So like the koalas that are found on Australia, you don't get them anywhere else naturally occurring, they're endemic to Australia. But equally, there are lots of species throughout the country that are found in tiny, tiny little spots. Anybody heard of a Wellermay pine or Wallamai pine? Found in just one valley, maybe two, in the Blue Mountains. That's it, just there. A tree that's been around since the dinosaurs, only exists there. So that's a real specific endemic. So what's interesting to note for me is that there's two biodiversity hotspots in Australia, southwestern Australia and the eastern seaboard of Australia. And this one for me is a big worry because by a lot of definitions of biodiversity hotspots, southeastern Queensland is nearly always considered a biodiversity hotspot. And where is one of the fastest growing regions growing in terms of human populations? Southeastern Queensland. Because of all the things that we love about nature, the trees and the hills and the views and the landscapes and the prettiness and the productivity, same things are attractive to us as it is to the koalas and the trees and the frogs and everything else that lives in that area. And southeastern Queensland is just being cleared, or Queensland and Australia in general, just being cleared at such a vast rate that biodiversity that people have gone there to live amongst won't be there for much longer if they're not careful. The rest of the definition, as well as being endemic, because of the endemic species, it's irreplaceable, but also it has to have lost 30% of its native vegetation, so it's irreplaceable and threatened. That's how Conservation International defines biodiversity hotspot. Threats to biodiversity include the habitat modification that we've just been talking about. This is a picture from the Yarra Valley. This is our native forests that our government logs to make paper and stuff, or sells, I guess, as wood chip. But it's a big issue, habitat modification, because as you can imagine, it's not just the trees that have been removed, it's all of those organisms that relied on the trees. These soils that had been protected for hundreds of thousands of however long, these soils that have been protected by the trees are also now in trouble. And this edge of these trees here, it used to be right in the middle of the forest. And so these trees like to be in the middle of the forest, and the animals that live in there require the forest all around them. And it no longer is the case. These trees are left, these are habitat trees. They're left to somehow offset the problem of destroying all the forest, but this tree that used to live in the middle of the forest, it's not going to last much longer there anyway. And as for the animals that live there, the sugar gliders that jump from one tree to the next, they're not super sugar gliders, they're just sugar gliders. So habitat modification, big problem. Of course, driven by the need to make money and the need to house people, find places for people to work, etc. Climate change, of course, big issue. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that, but climate change is already here and it's already harming biodiversity. Disease is another issue, and this is why the definition of biodiversity is a problem, because diseases, the more diseases you have, the more biodiversity you have, right? So, but anyway, disease can cause problems to what we can see and what we know. And really, we can only act on what we can see, on what we can know, on what we can study. And we also can see the results of those as well. But diseases that are driven by climate change and habitat modification and pollution and over-harvesting and all those things, when you put an organism under stress, as you know from your own experiences, you put an organism under stress, it tends to cause it a lot of problems in terms of health, well-being, and even life. You know, eventually you can stress an animal out, or a tree, stress it out till it dies. Over-harvesting is a fairly sizable issue for certain organisms, and I think that it's often glossed over. But there are no shortage of examples of animals that have been collected from the wild till they die. Anybody heard of a dodo? Anybody seen a dodo? That's an example of an animal that was over-harvested. So the conservation movement, like I said, it's historical. It goes back as far as these guys. So this beautiful man on your left here, with his glorious mullet, he tells me it's a wig. That's Charles II. Now Charles II, he had a bit of a troubled life, bless him, as you might know, but he liked to build stuff. It was very important to him that he had a navy with lots and lots of ships. And, you know, why wouldn't you, as king, a vassal of Lord God himself, why would you not just show your worth by building as much as you possibly can? But the guy on our right here, who was a gardener and a librarian and all sorts of good stuff, he's a very learned chap, he was very concerned that Charles II's projects were going to use all of the wood in England, chopping all the trees down. And he wasn't necessarily concerned that, the squirrels wouldn't have anywhere to live. He was just worried that literally they would use every tree that they'd got and that there would be no more trees to make any more boats. And that is possibly the first example of a conservationist. Even though we might not recognise that as conservation today, it's still an important point that if you use all the resources, you've got nothing left to build your navy with. Let's fast forward a few years, because it's easy to get photos for later. These guys, this is an American guy. This Ranald Martin was English, or Scottish I think actually, but he did a lot of work in India. And these two were some of the first people to really recognise that we were causing a bit of harm to our environment, and that we perhaps shouldn't, for all sorts of reasons. And then if you go fast forward to 1962, Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring. Rachel was really concerned about the impact of pesticides, particularly DDT, on the natural world. And this was probably the first time that a conservationist became a household name. And with Richard Nixon, who started the Environmental Protection Agency, and of course Al Gore, responsible for a little film called An Inconvenient Truth, and his work on climate change. And my point is that over time we've slowly become, conservationists have slowly started to work their way into the mainstream media and into most people's lives in one way or another. And so now Al Gore's still around, and we have this situation where conservationists walk among us, but we don't necessarily know who they are. I'm one of them. Anyway, we have more species than ever. No, that's not quite right. Over 99% of the species that ever existed on the planet have gone extinct. But we now know so much about our planet, and we have such a great biodiversity on our planet right now, that we think there are more species now than there were during the time of the dinosaurs, for example. There are also many species that are unidentified. So species that we, my goodness, there were 2 new species of spider found in Australia last year, and a new frog. This is Australia. This is, you know, we walk past these things in the street. There are so many plants that haven't been identified. so many insects. There is also some current problems that we've identified. Climate change is already here. We still talk about climate change as if it's in the future, but we know that it's here. We can see its effects regularly in our weather patterns, or our climate patterns, I should say, and the results of those. Scientists talk about this sixth major extinction event. So just like how dinosaurs were wiped out, we might now be doing the same to the biodiversity on the planet, but not by an asteroid hitting the Earth or any other number of reasons that caused the previous 5 mass extinctions, but this one is caused directly by our own actions. And that is a result of human population growth, and more importantly, the consumption that the population consumes. So humans, not only are there so many of them, but also each and every one of them wants more of everything, wants more progress, wants more economic growth. Completely understandable. But that's the situation that we're facing, and in the future, unless we do something about it, it's not going to get a whole lot better. So these animals all still are around, and they're all Australian species. You recognise this koala, this animal. Koalas are under threat, really. So back into the southeast Queensland story, and there's a lot of campaigns going on at the moment to try and protect the koalas that are in southeast Queensland, because they are under some terrible pressures, as they are over a lot of the country, and they might well be gone in 50 years if we don't start making some changes. And that's the koala. That's an animal that most people in Australia profess to love, and yet they might well be extinct in 50 years. Anybody recognise this? The bird in the middle? Nobody at all. Anybody? What about? Go on.
Might be a black-hearted finch.
It's a black-throated finch. Has anybody heard of it now? No, interesting. The black-throated finch has already been pretty well hammered by our actions, and if the Adani Carmichael mine goes ahead, it's almost certain it'll be gone. It'll be gone. Most of its habitat is in that area. It's an endemic, like I said, it's only found in a small area, and most of that area is right underneath that mine, or right on top of that mine, I guess, or where they want to put the mine. Anybody know this one? It's a bogong moth. Has anybody heard of those? Yeah, cool. They are this big, and they're a little bit creepy, if I'm honest. And I love all animals, but a little bit creepy. But they are really, really important as a food source for anything that eats moths. And this year there's been a population crash, and they would normally be all over the high country right now, and they would be eaten by possums and, like I said, everything that eats moths, and the population has crashed, and we can already see it, and it is very, very concerning. And it's also just one of many, many thousands of invertebrates that are really under some massive threats right now. Have you heard of the talk of the collapse of the invertebrate world, and how there's this expectation that if we don't do something about it, we're going to lose our invertebrates? And the thing is, people don't like flies, and they don't like mosquitoes, and nor do I. I hate cockroaches, but we need our arthropods, we need our invertebrates, because they perform so much for us. And if we lose them, we're in real trouble. Amphibians, 40% of amphibian species are threatened by our actions, mostly by our actions. 40%, that's huge. And this is an endangered species. This actually was a photo taken in New Zealand where they've been introduced because they have problems with invasive species outcompeting them, and habitat modification, and so on and so forth. That amphibians, they eat the mosquitoes and the flies that we just said we don't like. They're kind of important too. And they are a food source for so much. And not only that, we use them as bioindicators. And if we don't have our frogs anymore, we won't know what the rest of the ecosystem looks like. If we protect the habitats in which the frogs live, we'll protect so many other things, not just the animals that eat them and the animals that live in that habitat as well, but we need those freshwater systems for our own use. So, for the future, what can we do about it? There's some of these things are already being done. I've labelled them simple solutions, because they're not technological necessarily, but it's a very complex problem, as we've already discussed, and I don't know that any of these things could be considered simple. But nature reserves, literally, or preserves, I suppose I should have said, where you literally have one set of land and nature is prioritized, and I use nature, things, unhuman things that are not, synthetic. Set aside a block of land for the organisms that live in it, just go nuts. We have a few of these. We know that a lot of them are not big enough. We know that a lot of them are still being destroyed by us. We encroach on them. We have forests that we'll clear right up to the edge of the forest, and just like the clear fell earlier, once you get right up to the forest, you have that edge of habitat, which means that the edge is no longer the center of the forest, and that's a problem because the actual body of the habitat is only that bit in the middle. Species protection, so we have an Endangered Species Act, and we have species that are labelled as things we need to look after. It needs to be reinforced a lot more than it currently is, but it's a simple measure. It's easy to say, all right, we're going to make a new law, you can't harm species X. End of story. We can monetize conservation, so there's already stewardships available for people that have land to use some of that, leave it or manage it for wildlife as opposed to managing it for farming or whatever. And we can use the government to pay a bit of money to those people to have stewardships on their land. We need some kind of human consumption control. So like I said, it doesn't matter how big the population, it's the amount that they're consuming that's the problem. And we know that we have problems with things like plastics and things like carbon. And if we can just do something to just say, all right, no more, for example, single-use plastic bags, what a great idea. But more, obviously, is required. And there's also this concept of preventative conservation. So we can often see, with most of the species that have gone extinct in our lifetime, we can see it coming, we can see what the problems are, we can see what's causing it, and we can see what we can do to stop it, but we often don't. And I understand that it's really, really, really hard to sell a policy without economic growth. But if we don't, it's going to come back to bite us. And that is the crux of the problem, is that we need longer term plans. We have a government that changes hands every 3 years. We have research programs that will be 3 years in, and then they'll have a change of government and the funding will disappear from underneath them. It's ludicrous. But without a shift in the culture, without a shift from, we're only looking for economic growth, without a shift to maybe we should consider the longer term, because, a lot of this is the government's work, a lot of this is politics, but who votes in the government in the first place? A lot of this is, it was only last week or the week before, but we had hundreds of thousands of school children around the world marching to send messages to the governments of the world. We need to take action on climate change. And they don't vote yet, but they will. And I think that if we have more of that sort of thing, we stand a chance of getting somewhere. In lieu of that, there are more complicated solutions. So these are technologies that are being used today, or at least being studied today, to help inform biodiversity plans for the future. They are not limited to these three, but I don't. These are the three that I'm most familiar with. So we've got frozen zoos and de-extinction, if you've heard of de-extinction. If you haven't, you've heard of Jurassic Park. Captive breeding and regenerative farming. So the de-extinction, frozen zoos. So what was it? It's frozen, I can't remember what it's called now, but there's a project that basically is all about freezing cells of animals to be able to breed them later. So it's cryogenics for conservation, essentially. And there's currently 5,000 species in 22 facilities all around the planet that are freezing sperm and egg cells ready to use later. So what they do is they freeze the reproductive cells at, for some reason, minus 196. I'm sure there's a good reason for that specific number. But at that point, the cells become inactive. So they can be stored almost indefinitely. We don't really know how long, because of course we've only just started doing it, but that's the plan. Then when we want to, we can take those cells back out of the freezer, put them in a surrogate, so find another species that perhaps is better adapted for whatever reason, implant the embryo just like IVF, and job's a good one. Bob's your uncle, Maisie's your aunt, and your kid is not your own, but you've reactivated a species that's in some danger. So this has been done already, and actually most excitingly perhaps there was a recent find with a mammoth, a frozen woolly mammoth that was being defrosted, and they took the nucleus or the nuclei from some of the cells in the mammoth and they put them in mouse cells, and the nuclei were reactivated. So there was cellular activity from an extinct animal within the mouse cells, which, you know, if we can do that, we're good to go. The trouble is, one of the problems is, it's in the very early stages. So an active nucleus in a cell does not a mammoth make. You know, it's so much further along the line. We might have to act a bit quicker in order to help the organisms in trouble. And you know, this is the thought of bringing back a woolly mammoth. What about what I said earlier about the biodiversity being also the fungi and the bacteria in the plants and everything else as well? And there's also a big ethical question, which, you know, I'm not an ethics expert, but I'm pretty sure I can chuck you a couple of speculative reasons as to why it might be problematic to bring back animals from extinction. One of them is that if you have an animal that went extinct, if the reasons that it went extinct have not been removed, what are you going to do with it? Like, what would we do if say we brought back the woolly mammoth, and it might take us 75 years, but 75 years from now, I'm in my dotage, sitting in my old people's home, watching the telly, and there's a woolly mammoth walking down the street. And I just don't think it's a great idea in that respect. But more importantly, animals like the black-throated finch, which only lives in that small area, if we were to bring that back down the track, and the mine is still there and the habitat is still destroyed, where can you put it? You can't put it anywhere without it displacing something else potentially. It's extremely problematic, and this is why I talk about preventative conservation being a better idea. If we save the habitats and save the organisms that live there in the first place, we don't have to worry about this very expensive, very research intensive stuff. Captive breeding, a little bit easier, but basically the same concept, and there are lots of success stories. As we speak, I have colleagues that are breeding frogs, that they will return to the high country, frogs that were killed off by chytrid fungus, which you might have heard of, one of these fairly new to science diseases that causes massive problems in frogs, wiped out populations of frogs all the way through the high country. But where the frogs have been gone, when they're sure that the chytrid fungus has been cleared, they can reintroduce these captive bred frogs. Brilliant. Eastern barred bandicoots. There was a time we thought that they were gone for good. Now you can barely move for them. It's not strictly true. There's only some places where there's lots of them, but they're a success story, and they're hopefully going to continue to be as such. But there's a lot of problems with bringing back species, even from, you know, tiny population, and that is things like the same problems as you have with the cryopreservation, right? The de-extinction. If you haven't solved the problems that caused the extinction in the first place, then you haven't necessarily got anywhere to put your animals when you captive bred them. There's also real problems that some species won't breed in captivity. It takes so much work to find out what it takes for animals to breed in captivity. And if we have a crisis, and we just don't have the resources to do anything with it. This is a spider orchid, and there are lots of orchids, even in Victoria, that require a certain fungus that it lives symbiotically with amongst its roots. A mycorrhizal fungus requires that fungus in order to exist, to be alive. And so this is a success story in that they managed to isolate that fungus and then captive breed the orchids alongside the fungus. But there are squillions of similar orchids that we just wouldn't know where to start. You know the flying duck orchids? Have you seen those pictures of the orchids that are like ducks, they're an example. Can only find them in the wild. Nobody can breed them in captivity, like they're going to run away. But nobody can breed them at home. So it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to be the answer to everything, because there's going to be so many species that it doesn't work for, you know, and that's a shame, really, because but it will do for some species. So, you know, regenerative farming is another concept that is still, I think, quite controversial. I think the ideas are brilliant. The whole concept of using native vegetation, having extra tree coverage, and using what's still considered permaculture style ideas. So you don't have a monoculture, you don't have just fields and fields and fields of wheat. You talk about this permaculture literally meaning, you know, lasting. So self-sustaining farming practices. And it includes things like shade-grown coffee. Have you heard of shade-grown coffee? So you have coffee that's grown alongside the rainforest, that you don't have to chop down massive swathes of rainforest in order to grow coffee. You can grow it under the trees. It's a great idea. So it's still a bit controversial, but it does hold hope for the future. So the big question is, all of these things that I keep saying, still need to work on, still need to do some research, takes forever to work out what makes an orchid breed. And yet we know that there is some estimations that most species will be affected by climate change, habitat destruction, those big issues in the next 30 to 40 years. And many will go extinct sooner. You know, the koala maybe will have a collapse and will be gone just like that. The black-throated finch could be gone in the next 5 to 10 years if it all goes ahead. But whether we can lose a few species and be okay, or whether, you know, at some point there's a tipping point where we have catastrophic biodiversity loss, and we know we can manage without dodos and thylacine and you know, all sorts of extinct animals that have already gone, and that's fine. And it is a natural cycle that things will go extinct. The problem is that we're currently running at estimates of about 1,000 times the rate of natural extinction, which means that we could lose all our crops and all our food plants and all our everything really quickly. And that's the problem. We don't know when that's going to be. But if you think about how far we've come in the last 30 to 40 to 50 years, we've come a long, long way. And this is my message for today, is that although things can look dire and do look dire for the most part, 1978, the first test tube baby was born. 1978. It's within a lot of our lifetimes. 1979, women got paid maternity leave. Up until 1979, which was exactly 40 years ago, women were expected to just give up work and not get paid for it when they had children. In 1981, the first recorded human death from AIDS. Now, nowadays, if you contract HIV, it's treated pretty much like diabetes. It's not ideal, but you know, it's that we've come so far, and yet only 38 years ago, we didn't even know what it was. In fact, when that person died, we didn't even know what it was. And yet now we can manage it really effectively. In 1982, CD was introduced. Who's seen a CD in the last week? Exactly. So, you know, technology moves so fast, and science moves so fast, and culture moves so fast, that we really do stand a chance of doing something with it. First genome was sequenced in 1995. Now we are able to clone and to edit genomes in CRISPR. It's pretty incredible. In 1997, US PC ownership was at 35%. 35% of the population of America had a personal computer. Has anybody here not got a smartphone with them? Rest my case. It was 1997, that was, you know, you're barely getting served in pubs if you were born then. In 2005, Rolf Harris was appointed to do a portrait of Queen Elizabeth. We'll not say any more about him, but it wasn't that long ago, we all loved him. And in 2016, the age of consent was equalised across the whole of the country. By equalised, I mean that same-sex sexual activity and heterosexual activity had been, well, homosexual activity had been illegal for so long, and finally the age of consent was the same across the board. 2016, you know, last year, of course, as we know, thankfully, same-sex marriage was legalised as well. But my point is that these are issues that 50 years ago, there's no way I'd have been standing in front of you guys giving a talk. I'd have had to have gone home and cook the dinner for my husband and children. There's no way. And so we've come a long way in the last 40 years, and we can come a long way. And if we do come the same distance in the next 40 years, then we can do it. We really can make a big difference, and we can do something about it. So that's my plea, is to not give up hope and to really think that we can do something about this, and to set your mind to doing it, because it's really important. Thank you very much.
Maybe like one question.
Is that, yep, Jaden.
Yeah, on the topic of biodiversity, if we're thinking of, in the future, terraforming, say a planet, say Mars, and you were responsible for seeding the biodiversity on that planet, but we had finite capacity and resources to transport certain species there, and they had to be very good at their niche. Would you sacrifice high-performing species just to sort of trivially introduce some diversity for some other species that might just have some different colours, or might not perform quite as well? There might be a different species, but you just introduce them anyway, just for diversity?
What a great question. How can you define performing for me?
So for example, it might need to tolerate a lot of UV radiation, and photosynthesize.
So well adapted.
Yeah, well adapted for the particular niche that we might need when terraforming in a diverse climate.
That is a great question, and the answer to which I couldn't possibly tell you right now, because I think the world will be in such a different place when we get to that point. You have to ask me again then. So I guess my point is that we know that biodiversity as it stands currently is important for all those things that I listed, all those reasons. And so one would assume that diversity at that level is still important on other planets as well. And so I suspect that you'd be better off having as much diversity as possible on a new planet. But I mean, I think the question's so complex in terms of what budget you've got as well and things like that, that I think it's a great question, and I shall give it a lot of thought over the next 50 years. But I mean, we know that the higher the biodiversity, the better off everybody is, humans as well as the other organisms that live there and the soils and everything else. So opt for higher biodiversity if you've got the choice.
I've studied, one of my keen interests is in different phenomena in the world and different energetic forces around the world.
Okay.
Now, there was a BBC documentary recently about the Galapagos Island. Is there studies onto why places like the Galapagos, places like Snake Island, which is, I think that's off, don't quote me, off Brazil. Anyhow,
I don't know Snake Island.
Why are there such areas in the world that have such high density biodiversity compared to others? What's the reason for that, and why is it so hush-hush? No one really wants to understand it because we don't know.
So we do know, or at least we think we know, because of course that's the way that everything works. But a lot of high biodiversity hotspots, or at least places with high biodiversity, which depending on your definition, not necessarily considered hotspots, but they tend to be warmer. So the higher the temperatures, the more productive the ecosystem. So if you have, say, in a tropical area, you don't really have an off-season. So if you grow vegetables in Melbourne, you don't grow as much in the winter as you do in the summer. But if you're in the tropics, you don't have an off-season, so you can keep changing, producing all the time. There tends to be more water and more heat, so really things that speed up the metabolism of the organisms that live there, regardless of what they are. And there's also some historical biogeographical features, so places like, for example, Australia, which is extremely diverse, one of the most diverse places in the world, that's been isolated from everywhere else for so long. And that's why we have a high rate of endemics. So, a lot of it is to do with how animals can move. So if you're on a remote island in the middle of nowhere and have been isolated from the mainland, you don't have any option to colonise the island, so you're likely to have less biodiversity on an island that's remote.
What's interesting about the Galapagos is they've got species that, you know, date back to dinosaur even before that, but they're birds. They're animals that can travel, but they don't choose to. They choose to stay on that one island.
That's interesting. I guess I absolutely see your point. So I guess the question is whether it's that they choose to or whether they choose not to. I guess if you have everything you need where you are. But because of the way that evolution works, if they have, you know, and birds on the Galapagos is a great example of that. Each of those Darwin's finches that are also different from one island to the next.
Great.
But the point is that they, you know, they're so well adapted to life on that one island. You have to question, would they do so well on the island next door? Even though it's only there. For some reason they've turned very different from being there, so there must be a great difference, even if it's only isolation between the two. And it's sort of a bit circular as well, because if you have the isolation, whatever causes them to be isolated also causes them through genetic drift to become different.
Yes.
So over time you end up with a different species just from isolation. So if they're inclined to be isolated, they're also inclined to be different.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Put your hands together for Lynette.